So come on. There we go. All right, so there we go. Hello, Arthur. All right, so how is everybody? How was the weekend? Beautiful weather.
Was the weekend?
Think. All right. All right, so I thought we would pick up kind of where we left off in a sense. It's not really leaving off because it's the beginning of the next parsha, but it feels very connected, right? This because what we were talking about last week in this group, that the conversation we ended up having was very much about, well, what are the implications of having Abraham leave his family, right? To leave his homeland, to leave his father's house, so on and so forth, and go to Canaan, right? And to do what? To follow God, right? To follow God. And we had a bunch of conversation about how that is a really, here's Connie. Hello, Connie. How are you? And we sort of asked, so on one hand, right, we have Abraham as the first Jew, right? He's the first, maybe not the first Jew, but the first Ivri, right? The first Hebrew, the first person to sort of cross over the boundary. And we sort of implied that, well, he ended up having two sons, right? Ishmael and Isaac, one of whom doesn't really become the next Hebrew. In our tradition, Ishmael is associated with Muslims, right? With the Arabs and Muslims and so on and so forth. Although, of course, that's obviously that's incredibly anachronistic, right? Because we don't have Islam until the 6th or 7th, 8th century of the Common Era, right? So, that's a very late identification, but definitely this idea, right, that we are sort of sister religions, brother religions, right? So very close, but not our tradition, right? And then we have a similar thing with Esau and Jacob, right? So, and in the portion we just finished, Lech Lecha, right, ends with the birth of, not the birth of Isaac, right, but the announcement of. And how does Abraham react? He laughs, right? Right. They both end up laughing. So let's go back here, right? So, right. Right, and so this is when I will bless Sarah, right? Indeed, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she shall give rise to nations, rulers of people shall issue from her, not just rulers, but kings, right? Malchei. Right? And then Abraham, falls on his face, right? And laughs, Vayitzchak, right? Exactly Isaac's name. So it's not just Sarah who laughs, although it's great, right, that they both do, right? And what does he ask, right? It's very interesting to me. It just dawned on me this week, reading the Torah, as I was chanting the Torah in the synagogue. We were chanting the third triennial cycle. So it's these two chapters, chapter 16 and 17, and Sarah says, "Oh, Abraham, go and have a baby with my maidservant Hagar, right? How old is Abraham when he has a son with? He's 85, right? 86, something. He's in his 80s. He doesn't think anything of it. Of course, he just goes and has sexual relationship with Hagar, and she gets pregnant, and they have a baby, and it's just not a big deal for Abraham, but it's a big deal, right, for Hagar and Sarah, right? They have a big fight, right? But Abraham thinks nothing of it. As soon, 15 years later, right, or 13 years later, when Abraham is 99, he says, "Oh my God, I'm going to have a baby at 99. That's incredible." Wait, 85 is normal? I don't know what to make of it. I just noticed it this year. But anyway, and then also Sarah, right? So maybe the issue is Sarah, right? Hagar presumably is younger, right? Sarah is 90, right? A woman having a baby at 90 maybe seems crazier to him than a man having a baby at 86. Hello, how are you? Good, come on in. All right, so we're just talking about Abraham and his kids, right? Ishmael and Isaac. So we have just been Isaac now has been announced to Abraham, and it's very interesting, right, that whenever God appears to Abraham, usually God is telling Abraham to do something. What was the thing that he was telling him to do here? Does anyone remember? Before he tells him about Isaac, he says, it's time to circumcise yourself. Time to get circumcised, right? To put the covenant, right? The mark of the covenant should be in your flesh. And so what does he do, right? So Abraham took his son Ishmael and all his homeborn slaves and all those he had bought, every male in Abraham's households, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins on that very day, as God had spoken.
Beyond everybody.
Everybody. So this is where we get the tradition, right? That everybody who converts, I'm a convert, if you didn't know, right? I converted to Judaism as an adult, right? So when a male converts to Judaism, right, he either is circumcised or undergoes hatafat dam brit, right? Just a symbolic re-circumcision. And I think it's in part for that reason, right, that who is my symbolic father when I go to have an aliyah from the Torah, right? I'm Harav Yitzchak Lev ben Abraham v'Sarah, right? Right. The tradition is, right, that Abraham did not simply force everyone to get circumcised, right? He had them circumcised. He had them get circumcised in order so that they too would be part of the covenant. So from the very beginning of this tradition, right, Judaism has this sort of tradition of, it's a very interesting tradition, right? On one hand, Isaac is how I'm gonna, what does he say to about Isaac? In verse 19, Vayomer Elohim aval Sarah ishtecha yoledet lecha ben, right? Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you shall name him Yitzchak. Right? You laughed when I told you would have a son, so his name will be Yitzchak, right? But very important here, Vahikimoti et briti ito, right? I will maintain my covenant with him. Not with Ishmael, right, but with Isaac. So he has the proper husband, the proper wife, right? Sarah is so again, we see here in the Bible, right? Judaism is a patrilineal thing, right? A person is an Israelite because their father is an Israelite, but we see even here, right, that the covenant of Abraham is not handed down through Ishmael, it's handed down by which wife is the one that matters. Yeah, go ahead.
Makes kind of jumps from Hagar.
Ah, yeah, no, the whole thing with Hagar is really, really interesting. It's a very disturbing story, right, in many ways. And it also, so there's a very interesting back and forth that we see. On one hand, right, Ishmael is not the chosen son, right? He's the firstborn, but he's not the chosen one. This happens again and again and again, right, in the Torah, and at the same time, right, Ishmael is given all kinds of honor, right, as being an important person, right? So but to point out here, right, that Livrit Olam Lizaro Acharav, right? That so the ones that come after Isaac, right, are the ones that matter, right? But for Ishmael, right, I bless him. I will make him fertile and exceedingly numerous. He shall be the father of 12 chieftains, and I shall make of him a great nation, right? And Hagar, right? The rabbis identify Milcah, right, who is Abraham's second wife, as being Hagar. Right? And he has a whole second set of children with Milcah, who again the rabbis associate with Hagar. Right. So
it sets it up to be the two of them to Ishmael.
I'm sorry.
It sets it up for Ishmael to be angry, even though he's getting all these other.
Yeah, right. And it's interesting, actually. I don't know where. I don't remember off the top of my head, right? But what kind of a guy Ishmael will be, right? He's going to be the kind of guy that's always fighting with his brothers, right? And Isaac, we see later on in the Torah, right, is a much more conciliatory type of person. But
well, so Hagar is a servant. So in her mind, she might not have thought she would get any cargo, so to speak, but she might wanted her son to be higher than just being a servant.
Right. Well, right. I mean, and I think again, I think the Torah works on a whole range of levels, a whole variety of levels. And so there is that sort of contextual story, right, which is kind of enraging, right, how Hagar is treated, right? It's on the edge of domestic abuse, right, of really mistreating a domestic worker, right?
I'm sorry, I'm just thinking that, we don't, it's a bigger story that maybe created. But maybe Hagar, that person up unhappy and to do that.
I mean, it's quite possible, right? I mean, the thing is, on one hand, yeah, you're making it up. On the other hand, the Torah is so cryptic is the wrong word, but it's so efficient, it's so economical, right, with its characterizations that there's all kinds of holes for us to fill in. So why not, right? If that's a meaningful way for you to understand the Torah's story, right, of this sort of this conflict between the mothers, right, which is also a conflict, right, between, as Ruth is saying, right, between the mistress and the servant, right, which is a whole other sort of set. I mean, right, there's a very interesting sort of set of complicated relationships between servants and masters throughout the Torah also. Yeah, go ahead.
But God doesn't say to Ishmael, to Hagar, it's with the lamb. He's not saying that he's going to be, that his seed is going to be in the covenant. It's it's to Yitzchak, not to Ishmael.
Right.
So Ishmael is not even a thought here.
Well, it's a very important thing to remember, right? That, that Judaism, the Torah, right, is telling the story of a nation, right? The nation of the Jews, right, which came out of this family, right? So the way that the story works, right, is that the nation emerges from the line of Jacob, right, which comes from Isaac, which comes from Abraham. And it doesn't, right? So Ishmael is an offshoot, right? And Esau is an offshoot, right? It doesn't mean that necessarily they're less important, right? Or less worthy of attention or honor, right? It just means that they are not our line, right? So when you have a family tree, right? You have the main trunk and then you have all the branches, right? But if you go to a different branch, all of a sudden that becomes the trunk and you're on one of the branches, right? So it's sometimes hard to think about it both ways, right? So to get back to this, right? Yes. So Isaac, right, is the one who is going to be. So we have a very strong emphasis here, right, on who is your parents. That determines on whether or not you're going to be part of the tribe, right? And at the same time, right, the rabbis are very canny, right, and they point out, yeah, but Abraham took all of the servants, right, all of the everybody, and circumcised them, brought them into the covenant also, right? So it doesn't depend on who your daddy is, right, or on who your mommy is, right? It depends on whether or not you're part of the covenant, right? So both are true, right? Which is a little bit hard. It's just in general hard to sort of completely hold those two truths in your head at one time, right? But they both are true. Go ahead, yeah, please.
If we have the servants, he's been some there too.
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm not sure that Abraham is saying that, but I think the rabbis are saying that Abraham is saying it. Does that make, do you understand the difference?
If you take it to the contemporary time, no. Some extent to reach
Oh, right, exactly. Well, and actually, yeah, it's contemporary times, right? Like now, right? And there's actually, some conversations among rabbis about this, right? Because the way that our tradition has made conversion so complicated, right? If you want to become a Muslim, right, you say the Shahada and that's it, you're a Muslim, right? If you want to become Christian, right, I'm sure you have to do some learning, but basically you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and you're a Christian. That's it, right? You want to become Jewish? Sorry, you got to study for a year, right? If you're in an Orthodox setting, you've got to live like an Orthodox Jew with some certain exceptions for a year, and you've got to live like more Orthodox than the average member of the community, right? To prove your bona fides, right? And you got to jump through all the hoops, right? Everyone, I don't know if everyone here has seen it, but in my generation, most people had seen the episode of Sex and the City where the girl wants to go and convert to Judaism so she can marry her Jewish sweetheart, right? And she goes and looks for the rabbi who, slams the door on her. God forbid I ever do that to anybody, right? But that's in popular culture, right? Like, oh no, you can't. We don't want you, But actually, no, it's not that we don't want you, right? It's just, why was it so hard to convert to Judaism, right? Because it was dangerous to convert to Judaism. And it was dangerous for the people who converted you to convert you to Judaism in a context where that would be that would be a betrayal of your Christianity or of your Islam, right? And it could be really dangerous. It was often illegal, right? So we're going to make it as hard as possible to make sure that you really, really want to convert. Is that really the way we want to make conversion today? I don't think so. On the other hand, it's good. It is actually good, I think, to have some hoops, right, to make sure it's not just a sort of a random decision. But yes, you're right. But back then, like in the Talmudic times, it was not nearly as hard to convert to Judaism as it is now. Yeah. Go ahead, Harley.
I want to ask you a question. If you have a Jewish girl and a non-Jewish, we believe that the child is automatically Jewish because the mother is Jewish. Does he have, let's say it's a boy, does he have to be circumcised? And what happens if he's not circumcised? He's not Jewish? In terms of the boy, the baby, the boy. No.
Oh, okay. So there's a couple of different questions here that you're asking, Harleen, all of which are important and related in a certain sense to this whole question of Abraham, right? So he circumcises Ishmael. Doesn't that make Ishmael Jewish? Right? Well, that's kind of, on one hand, it's kind of up to Ishmael. Right? On the other hand, right, yes, in most forms of rabbinic Judaism, up until the last decade or so, maybe 2 decades now, the presumption was that a Jewish mother has a Jewish kid. In the Reform movement over the last couple of decades, it's shifted a little bit. It's presumed that a Jewish parent who, with the agreement of the non-Jewish parent, raises their kids Jewish, means the kids are Jewish, even if the father is the one who's Jewish and the mother is not Jewish. But in a Reform context, if there's a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father, and they don't raise the kids Jewish at all until all of a sudden it's time for a bar mitzvah, right? And they show up at the synagogue expecting to get a bar mitzvah, very often Reform synagogues will turn them away, right? Whereas then they go to Chabad, right? And Chabad, of course, yeah, go ahead.
The Reform, what did you say that the Reform synagogue will do what?
The Reform synagogue will say, well, the kid had to be raised Jewish. You didn't raise him Jewish. You raised him as the inelegant phrase we use today, as nothing, right? Yeah, which is a terrible phrase. What am I? I'm nothing. I go, oh no, you're something.
In the politics of today, if it's not an Orthodox conversion, and the family wants to live in Israel,
even if it's an Orthodox conversion, if it's not by the right Orthodox rabbi, yeah. Actually, they're trying to change that in Israel now. I don't know where that legislation stands, but they're trying to shift it because there are so many people in Israel who are not Jewish who are, for a variety of reasons should be Jewish, and it's very complicated. But I'm sorry? Because a lot of Russian Jews are not halakhically Jewish. So yeah, it's a very complicated. But to get back to your question, right? If the father is not circumcised, but the mother is Jewish, barring this whole Reform thing, which makes things a little bit more reasonable, but also more confusing, right? If it's a Jewish mother, it doesn't matter about the status of the circumcision of the father. That doesn't matter. And circumcision doesn't not make a boy Jewish. It just affirms his Jewishness. So for better or for worse, more and more Jewish parents are choosing not to have their kids circumcised. Right? It's considered, not kosher among certain circles, right? So, but that doesn't mean that the kid is not Jewish. It just means it might be a little bit awkward at Jewish some. Yeah. So, all right. So he takes them all, right, and he circumcises everybody in his household, right? And he was 99 years old when he circumcised the flesh of his foreskin. And his son Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Thus, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised on that very day. So very interesting, right? They repeat this phrase, but etzem hayom hazeh, on that very day. Right? That's the day they did it. And again, they repeat, and all his household, his homeborn slaves, as well as those that had been bought from outsiders, were circumcised with him. so it's in this context, right, of circumcision, right, of the announcement of Isaac's birth, right, and the very interesting sort of phrase here, right, Vayechal ledaber ito, right, he was done speaking with him. This is the end. I'm done with you. I'm leaving, right? So God, I mean, again, this becomes an issue later in Jewish theology. What does it mean that God comes and goes? God doesn't come and go. God just is, right? Maimonides has some real things with this whole poor portion. So God was gone, right? Vayal Elohim al Abraham.
Can that be physically gone or just in his ghost?
Hey Ruth, you're getting right to the This is what's been shredding the cups of the Jews for centuries. What does it mean that God comes and goes? Right? Yeah. Maimonides would say, don't ever think that God comes and goes.
No,
God is always around, right? And you see God, if you're a prophet like Abraham, God comes and goes, right? I mean, no, you see God and you stop seeing God. It's all in a prophetic vision, right? And he has reasons to say that even though God talks, right? God talks to Hagar, right? That Hagar is not a prophet, whereas Miriam is, right? All kinds of fine distinctions between who's a prophet, who's not a prophet. Yeah, go ahead.
I always thought that happened is, like when you were teaching your child to ride a bike, at some point your presence is there in their minds. They have to do with themselves. And that, like he's saying, you gotta do some of this stuff.
Yeah, I love that. I love the idea of God, the metaphor of God being the parent teaching their kid to ride a bicycle is amazing, right? It's amazing, right? Sort of like, and it's so funny because whenever I think of teaching my kids to ride a bicycle, I had two very different models. My first kid had a bike with training wheels. It took him forever to learn how to ride a bike. By the time the second one came along, I was smarter. I had a bike without pedals and a bike without training wheels and without pedals. He was riding a bike with it like this. So anyway, but I don't know what theological, maybe God gets smarter as he goes along. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, there is this moment when you were saying this moment that just popped in and out of, but unfortunately popped out of my head as well. When God is talking to Hagar, right? And God says, where you are Sarah's servant, right? Where are you going? And she says, I'm running away, right? Why is Hagar running away from Sarah? Or I think it's some Sarai at that point still, right? It's because, what does it say? Sarai was mistreating her, right? The same root that we use on Yom Kippur, right? Affliction, right? When we are on Yom Kippur, we're supposed to afflict ourselves. That's what Sarai is doing to Hagar. Right? And what does God say? What does the angel of God say to Hagar? Go back and be afflicted, right? Yeah, which is a really awesome. If you were talking to, anybody who takes God's response there as what you should say to a woman who's suffering from domestic abuse, right? You're doing it wrong, right? You missed the point. I can't say I know exactly what the point the Torah is trying to make there, right? But I don't think it's that, right? I don't think it's like go and endure abuse, but it does feel to me something along the lines of what you're saying, right? Which is that there's going to, there's a point at which, right, you will have to ride the bike by yourself. And yeah, you might fall over and hurt yourself, right? It might involve pain and injury, right? But you have to do it yourself. Right?
Stand up for
And maybe that's what it is, right? Maybe it's also that you I mean, it could also be, right, in a certain way, right, that you two are linked, right? You're linked as the sort of co-wives of the same man. And there's, and again, we would never say that today, right? But in the context, of trying to think about it metaphorically, right? But then there are certain situations we can't escape and we need to live through. Yeah, go ahead.
What she said about riding a bike got me thinking maybe God was learning as he went along how to handle our drama, how to handle people. And everything was an experience for him because he created the world, there was nothing. And we don't know what God was before.
Right.
So
Right. There's
if you think about what the desert and all that,
Yeah.
Till the end, he changes, the way he views things. And so he's growing too.
Right.
I love that because I think of God's also riding a bike.
Oh, okay. He's got one of those big two wheelers. No, one wheel, those big one wheelers. Yeah. He's learning.
That's right. Well, I mean, in a sense, right? I mean, there's a long tradition, right, of seeing the growth of God, right, through the Torah, right. I don't think it's a linear thing, right? The Torah doesn't work that. The Torah is not a sufficiently unified document to present sort of a linear picture of a. But I do think there's definite change over time, right? You definitely see God certainly depicted differently in different parts of the Bible. All right, so to continue here, so just to point out, right, God was gone from Abraham. So we have this whole business about the circumcision, and then we have the next chapter, Vayera, right? So very interesting, and someone pointed out, I was reading this book of rabbinic, actually it was, I think it's more Hasidic, this one, right? Look, says here, right, Vayar Elav Adonai. The Elonei Mamre. Very interesting, right? The Lord Adonai appeared to him. Now, the translation puts who first? Yeah, well, actually, the translation puts the Lord first. Right, but Elav comes first, right? So, Vayera Elav. So, and appeared to him. Right? And who's him? Abraham. Right? No, I think now it's already Abraham. And so very interesting, right? That we just got finished saying, right, that God was done. God left Abraham. Now God has come back, right? But we don't say Adonai Yareh, right? El Abraham, right? We're assuming that we already know that this is Abraham. So why does Abraham come first? Is sort of the question. Why would Abraham be the first one before? Yeah. Yeah. So I'll just read what this guy says to us, right? Which I thought was kind of interesting. One would expect the logical sequence to be, right, that I'd like the translation, right? Adonai appeared to him, right? Or to Abraham, right? Because so the fact that it's a love, right, means that it's really just a continuation of the previous story. Right, and this is where the rabbis get this idea that why did God come to him?
To Abraham.
Right, yeah, why did God show up to Abraham now?
That's this great job.
The circumcision. Not only did he finish the job of everybody getting circumcised, but he was a 99-year-old man. It hurts, right? It
Do it.
I don't want to think about it, Nikki. Yeah, no, I mean,
Sharp
presumably with a sharpened stone,
Oh.
and yeah, ouch is right, right? So, yeah, go ahead.
That 15 Russian boys come to them. Because they all had the circumstance.
Mm,
They were living out.
oh, I'm sure.
Living out. They went through it.
I-
Oh, 15,
Wow.
they came into today. I assume somebody would help them at the time. They were Russian. They did it, and that was
That was, yeah. I mean, it's certainly not unheard of. I mean, I had one of the rabbis who was involved in my own conversion had, talked about how he had been counseling a guy who was converting but hadn't been circumcised. And, this is in the reform movement, so it was not a strict necessity, right, for conversion. But the guy did it. And, it's a big deal. It's not easy. And so the tradition says, right, why did God come to Abraham at this particular point? Right? It's because it's Bikor Cholim, right? And we actually get the whole idea about Bikor Cholim, meaning visiting the sick. Right? We get that we are imitating God. Right? We show up when someone is ill, when someone's recovering from surgery. We show up. Why do we show up? Because we want to support that person. And the rabbis will go further with Abraham here, right? It's sort of a reward, because it's the only time that God shows up and doesn't say anything to Abraham, right? It doesn't sort of give him more instructions. He just appears, right? Which again is sort of like a Bikor Cholim. You show up, you don't show up for Bikor Cholim and say, why did you get sick? You should do this, right? You come in and you sit with someone, right? You come in and you support them. You don't berate them. You don't tell them what to do. You don't tell them to circumcise themselves or to all the other crazy things that Abraham was told to do. You don't tell them to,
Does he
just,
show up after the birth of the baby?
right. You don't show up after the birth of the baby and say you have to sacrifice this baby, right? Yeah. All right. So he says, it is possible to say, according to Maimonides, right, that one cannot ascribe to the Holy One any change. We were talking about this, right? Does God really show up? Right? Maimonides says no way. Right? God does not, right? Variation of motion. Moreover, we find in stories in the Bible, such as the one before this, and Adonai appeared to him, right? And the like, there's no intention to remove God from God's place, right? God doesn't literally come down, but rather that God's drawing near, or God's revelation to human beings, depends on what? Human beings, to be sure, yeah.
Abraham, in his pain, is saying to God, put me through this, where are you?
Ah, very
And
nice.
so,
Very nice. So you both have come up with lovely ideas, right? Which is not what this commentator says, but I love them both, right? That it depends on the perception of people, right? Like God is kind of everywhere, right? And it's really up to us to be able to notice it, right? So that, to really have a sense of God being there, comforting you in your pain, right, depends on your receptivity to that, right? And also, right, or a demand, like, I'm in pain, right? Come and help me out, right? But also feeling that that's possible, right? Yeah, go ahead.
but everything God has done, first he told him to leave his family, and then about Hagar, and then now the circumcision, and, I mean, it's one thing after another. So he's still testing him. And Abraham is passing. with pain, as they say.
Yeah.
He's listening to him.
Right.
And he's still trying to see if this man will have faith enough.
Well, it's interesting, right? It's interesting that here is something, right, that where God doesn't come down with any demands here, right?
Yeah.
Right. So and Abraham doesn't only listen to God, right? Abraham also listens to Sarah, right? So Sarai says, "Go sleep with my maidservant, so maybe we'll have a kid." And what does it say? And Abraham listened to Sarai and did as he was told, right? And later, when Sarai gets upset with him, he says, "Okay, you're in charge of Hagar. Do whatever you want." Right? And later, when Sarah says you have to banish Ishmael and Hagar because they're interfering with Isaac, right? What does he do? He listens, right? He listens to Sarah. All right. So to continue here, right? So you came up with related and wonderful ideas about how does God appear? Why does God appear to people? Right? He is going to say this guy. It's called the Devash B'Chalav, right? It's the Devash B'Chalav. This is from the Milk and Honey. This is from the late 19th century. It is that there is no intention to rebut, but rather that God's drawing near, or God's revelation to human beings depends on our drawing near to God, and not the other way around. Right? So that why does God appear now to Abraham, even though he was done? Right? It says by Hal L'daber ito. He was done talking with him, and he went. Right? He comes back now because Abraham drew near to him, right, through the act of circumcision. For example, and then he brings a bunch of different examples from Torah, from Tanakh. Right, we notice the sequence of the loving and the Song of Songs. I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine. Right, first I'm my beloved, and that makes my beloved be mine. Right, which implies that first I give myself to my beloved, and only then does my beloved give himself to me. This is really only another way of saying that it is according to a person's spiritual readiness and preparation that they will attain an awareness of God. So again, a little bit like what you're saying, perception, right? Human perception. Right? The same idea is also in Proverbs 8. Those who love me, I love, and those who seek me will find me. Yeah, go ahead, Nikki.
That's hard when you move forward. Because then let's say the Holocaust.
Yeah.
It's the fault of the people.
Right.
I don't buy that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can see how it'd be easy to read it that way. I mean, obviously the Devash Halav died in 1930, so he died before the Holocaust, but certainly he knew about Jewish history, right? He knew about the pogroms. He knew that miraculous rescue was not always the way God worked. Right? Right, and so was that it raises the same old kind of question that we always have, right? Do we blame the victim, right, for not being spiritually right? But again, that presupposes that the only way that God can interact with humans, right, is to physically save them, right? And I think that's what's powerful about this particular piece, right, is that God doesn't really do anything, right? God is just there. Right? And so presuming that for God to be present means that God will do some sort of a miracle, right? That's not the way that God works, at least in this part of the Torah.
That's better. That's
Right,
easier.
right. And that just because someone perished, right, in some sort of a terrible tragedy, doesn't mean that God wasn't there with them. It just means that God was there with them in their moment of tragedy, not saving them from that, if that makes
So
sense.
it's kind of like you grew up a limb, right? It's there, the visitor.
Right,
It's also there. It's present.
right,
You're not alone.
exactly. You're not alone. Right, right,
It's
exactly.
also
Yeah,
like Shiva.
right,
You don't go to Shiva to talk to the person and make them feel better. You go to be with them.
right.
And let
And let them talk.
them talk or not.
Right, right, or not. Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
So that's what happens.
And that's exactly what happens here, right? Is that God doesn't do anything, right? And I think it's really interesting, right, to think about that idea of God, right? That it's not, God does not go and say, oh, you circumcised yourself and let me just touch your foreskin and it's going to be miraculously healed, right? God doesn't do that, right? God just comes and is with them.
Well, sometimes it comes to just that person there, even if they don't say a word to you. Just to know that by being there, you care.
Exactly.
And that's what it's
Right.
all about.
Maybe separates us them from the pagan gods who we're supposed to around.
Right. I mean, I think, right. But I mean, and I think again, we get caught up in Elijah moments, if you know what I mean. When Elijah goes and he has a big smackdown, right, with the prophets of Baal, right? He sort of forces the God of the Israelites to show up and do tricks, right? And that's one of the reasons why Elijah is a very complicated prophet, right? Because that's not necessarily the prophet's job, right? The prophet's job is not necessarily to force God to come down and prove that God is different than the more real than the pagan gods. Right? So it's a very complicated. But you're right that the pagan gods, right, are supposed to do all this stuff.
Also, it's kind of funny, but there's always this thing about the Elijah Passover. That we used to say to the kids, see, the line's going down, the line's going down. Well, if you have the perception it's going down fine, but you know what's
Elijah's cup is like Santa Claus, right?
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
Right.
Santa Claus of my Savior.
Right. Well, no, I mean, but again, I mean, I think the point, right, is that if you look for literal truth, or truth is the wrong word. If you look for, if you want it to be literally true that Santa Claus comes around, you're barking up the wrong tree, right? If you want it to be literally true that Elijah actually drinks his wine, sorry, right? It doesn't really work that way. But as a metaphor, right, for the power that we invest in our tradition, in our stories, right, of deliverance, right, of someone who's going to be there symbolically at every celebratory moment, right? There's a chair of Elijah at every bris, right? Every brit pot, we have a chair of Elijah because Elijah shows up at every one of these celebrations. Literally, the same way that Santa Claus literally comes down the chimney of every, I don't know, not Christian, but every Santa believing family. Like, okay, no, not really, right? But it's a metaphor for something much bigger than that, right? Much more important than that. All right, so just to finish this up, and the language also in the Kabbalistic maxim, by means of awakening below comes the awakening on high, or perhaps by means of the awakening on the outside comes the awakening within, right? So this idea, right, that we have sort of an external experience of something, and that triggers an internal experience, right? Or in sort of, if we don't like the outside, if we don't like the superficial depth kind of metaphor, we're more comfortable with the earth and heaven metaphor, right? The Kabbalistic notion is that what we do here on earth really matters up there. It really matters to God, right? So that God appears in a certain sense because we do the circumcision, right? We do this, again, literal, symbolic, however, however we understand it, right? Whatever circumcision ends up being a metaphor for, right? We do that, right? And that leads to God's presence. Right? And then what I think is so interesting about this, among other things, right? He was sitting there at the entrance of the tent. Who again was sitting there? Abraham, right? Abraham is sitting there, right? So interesting, right? Abraham keeps on coming up, but he's always who, right? He's always he, right? And looking up, he saw three men, right? And what does he do? He's supposedly sitting there writhing in pain, right? But he sees the people and he runs, right? So this is like the morning person at Shiva, right? You show up and you're like, I'm just going to be sitting with you. No, I got to give you this and I got to give you that. We've all met that person, right? We've all met the person who's mourning their dead, but no, I can't. I don't have time to mourn. I got to get everyone the food that they need, right? It's so Abraham is that guy, right? And so this again, the rabbis try to turn this around, right? And what do they say, right? He to greet them and bows to the ground. He says, if it pleases you. Right, very interesting, right? Adonai, right? There's three of them. But what does Adonai mean? It means God, right? I mean, it means Lord, right? This is a very interesting reading, right? Is he addressing all three of them, or is he addressing one of them, right? Because Vayomer Adonai, and he says my lords or my Lord. It's not clear which it is in English because the Hebrew is ambivalent or is ambiguous. Imna matzati chenda einecha. If I have found favor in your eyes, meaning one person's eyes, right? In one, right? So is he addressing God, right? Is addressing God, saying Adonai, meaning God in the singular, or is he meaning Adonai is technically a plural word, right? Meaning my lords. Right, it's ambiguous in the text. We won't get stuck on that too much, right? And they want to do. He says, "I'm going to bring water. I'm going to bathe your feet. You're going to recline under a tree. I'm going to get you something to eat." Right? He brings he brings the tray for banquet. Right? He brings a calf. I know a calf. He brings a calf or a lamb. I forget what it is. Right? But he also brings curds and whey. Right? So he forgets about kashrut, right? Yeah. And what do they say? They say, "Do as you have said." Right? In the midrash, it actually says, "Oi, you don't need to do it, but if you want to." And also because these three people turn out to be malachim, right? Messengers or angels, right? And do angels eat? No. So it doesn't matter. So why are the angels letting him do it? Because he wants to, right? And
because
he's a host, right? And it's a big mitzvah, right? A big mitzvah to do hospitality, right? And so even though it's not necessary, right? It's a in a sense, right? It's important to allow people to do a mitzvah, right? Obviously, in real life, if you're not going to eat anything, you should probably be clear about it. But again, the point, right, is that Abraham knew that it was the mitzvah. According to the rabbis, of course, Abraham knew all the mitzvahs, right? He knew all 248 positive mitzvahs and all 316 negative mitzvahs, right? Or 364 rather, negative mitzvahs, right? He was a very, very well educated Jew, right? But wait a second, he didn't really know them. The Torah hadn't been given yet, right? He knew them because just in his gut, right? He knew them in his feet. Go ahead, Nikki.
Christ is on the cross. He says,
Azabtani, right? Right.
And it's because this is not I don't know, not the right thing, but he felt abandoned. He didn't have that aura around.
Well, right, and you're getting into Christian texts, so harder for me to speak with any kind of authority about, because I don't know them well enough. But again, like I think the New Testament is also telling a theological story, right?
Yeah.
Right, and again, I think that and I think what's interesting about that, right, is that sort of one of the central sort of Christian paradoxes, right, is that for Jesus to be able to redeem all of humanity, right, what did Jesus have to do? He had to suffer, right?
Suffer and die.
Suffer and die, right? And so like there's a sort of necessity of suffering. Now Christianity does it by saying, okay, well, we're putting all the suffering on Jesus, right? We don't have that in Judaism, right? The suffering is more distributed, shall we say, as it is in real life in Christianity, by the way. It's not as though Christians aren't suffering.
I just want to add something that came into my mind as a hostess. They have guests who come and don't eat. Well, one is a diabetic, one is lactose intolerant, one can't eat ice cream and this and that. Okay, so don't eat.
Yeah. Well, these days, having a dinner party is a whole minefield. I mean, you can't have a dinner party without asking everyone what their dietary. I mean,
if you don't like it, bring your own.
Right. I mean, I remember when I was younger, my parents would have people over for dinner. Never was anyone ever asked what they eat and what they don't eat. Right. You just show up. And I remember it was a shock when my aunt and uncle showed up one time with a piece of fish because they decided they weren't going to eat meat anymore. And we were all like in an uproar. What are you not going to eat meat? How can you do that? Oh my God. But now, no, it's
No, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
I have to
So if
laugh.
you're an angel and you don't eat, tell your hostess you don't eat. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. Time. Yeah.
I said to end it.
Yeah. Oh, is that? Oh, I'm looking at that watch, that clock behind us, and we are right on time. But according to this clock, we are past time. I apologize. I will either change that clock or I will pay attention to my clock. All right. So we're all done. 5:02. I apologize. I didn't recognize that this clock is slow. All right. So thank you, everybody. Shavua Tov.
Thank you so much.
See you soon. See you next week.
That's really
Thanks.
good. Thank you.
So where did you teach in New York? Oh, wonderful. How long did you teach there? Wow. What did you teach tonight?
No, I didn't teach them. One of the rabbis.
Oh, okay.
Public speaking. I was in charge of the debate team, so we had a debate team. And
Yeah.
they invited the girls to meet on those, the rabbis were having fits about it.
I'm sure.
I said, we're not going to touch each other. We're going to be in the same room. We're not going to touch each other. And Rabbi Lamb,
Yeah.
his infinite wisdom supported this.
Yeah.
And so it worked.
That's good. That's good. No, I mean, I think there's a guy there now. What's his name? Gosh, I can't remember his name. Should remember his name because he's kind of a. But he came to Harvard Hill where I also work, and he was talking about, the different forms that feminism took in the yeshiva versus in Chabad, and how they both have a very, each have their own distinct way of addressing the issue of women in Torah. So,
What is not being addressed now is the young people who are calling themselves they instead of he or
oh
she.
yes,
That is totally not being addressed.
yeah,
And the kids, once they leave the high school, they go to Israel for a year to learn, some stay 2 years. And then they go up to colleges.
Yeah.
And they don't know how to handle it.
Yep.
So they have to rely on their friends
Yep.
and sometimes misguided people.
Yep.
So I think the
Oh, it's really interesting. My rabbinical school, I was just talking to a student. I hope that dogs. Oh, here's one other. Yeah, I was just talking to a friend, to a woman who just started at Hebrew College. And the school is, was uh, open and affirming to transgender people. And now that's where all the transgender Jews go for rabbinical school. So it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out and where they all end up. Because I think that obviously there's transgender people everywhere. And so like how to manage things for people who are transgender is going to be important. You're okay with increasingly important, and not just in liberal synagogues. It's going to be important everywhere.
There's no question because my kids are reading this.
Right. It's happening from. I mean, it's amazing to me. People say, like, college is turning into and I'm like, well, it has to happen somewhere, right? Because this is not one thing that I remember there used to be this thing about gay lifestyle, and people who were sort of, or the homosexual lifestyle, and there were people who were sort of, no, that was happening because people were realizing they were gay and they wanted to live. And that was it,
And they were also not wanting to share it with it because it happens to them.
Right, exactly. And so now to have a place where people feel comfortable being who they are is really super challenging, but it's really important.
Black lives.
Yeah.
This particular generation has
A lot going on.
a lot going for it because of.
No, my son, I was talking to him yesterday, my ex-wife and I, we had two kids. And we couldn't have any more. And he's 18. And he said, the two of you were really thinking about adoption. And I said, yeah, we really wanted to. My sister actually adopted, didn't want to adopt. She had one kid, elected, she didn't want to. Like, I don't know what she was thinking about the situation. We always knew that you would be big brother. It's really interesting. But yeah, he knows. I mean, he knows himself. But he had a not.
So what is your son?
He's an Everett message. Oh yeah. What are they studying? My son, my other son is like. Yeah, I told him I did that. So, don't be shy about, ask me about the microphone. And feel like yourself. And we know. Well, 6 people is not bad. Yeah, I mean, it's. All right, great, good to see you. Oh, who's good? Rosie, Rose, stop it. It's so annoying.